All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is championship week here in the 2024 fantasy football season, so you know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single quarterback and tight end, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting in week 17. All right, let's kick the video off with the first of two Christmas Day games. Let's start with the Chiefs traveling to face the Steelers. And it's not my favorite matchup when it comes to the quarterback and tight end position. I think Patrick Mahomes is very startable in this game, but he just kind of falls into that category for me. Depends on who you've got, what your options are. Do you have another quarterback with a little bit more upside? Tough matchup this week against the Steelers, who are giving up the third fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. But Mahomes was really solid this past week with 23.7 fantasy points, 28 of 41, 260 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 33 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. So Mahomes still very startable, but we have the three previous weeks he had 16 or less fantasy points. He's been a bit up and down. The ceiling hasn't quite been there, but he is the quarterback 10 on the season so far in fantasy. So he's startable, but I don't love the matchup. And the ankle injury did not seem to hold him back this past week, but it's still out there, I suppose. So I don't hate Mahomes this week, but not my favorite start. And the same thing goes for Travis Kelce. I think he's very startable, but you just don't know what you're going to get, right? We had 9.5 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games and 8 or less in his last 2. 8 fantasy points this past week, 7 targets, 5 grabs, 30 receiving yards. And he's the tight end 10, coincidentally, on the season. So he's still startable, but certainly not my favorite start. The Steelers 16th against opposing tight ends, so it's an okay matchup here, but, it just kind of depends on who you've got. Then Noah Gray, I think it's kind of out of the streaming category for me. It's way too risky in the fantasy championship. He only had 2 fantasy points this past week, so I'm avoiding Noah Gray this week. And looking at the Steelers, I'm avoiding Russell Wilson as well. 16.3 fantasy points last week against the Ravens, 22 of 33, 217 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, an interception, a lost fumble, and 27 rushing yards. He gets the Chiefs this week. Not a good matchup. I just don't think you need to start Russell Wilson in any capacity this week, even in like a double quarterback super flex format. Now, Pat Freiermuth had a very disappointing week 16 in a good matchup against the Ravens. Just 3 targets, 3 catches, 16 receiving yards, no touchdowns. But I'm still going to leave him in the streaming category this week, as the Chiefs are giving up the 28th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends so far on the season. So he might not be my favorite streaming option because he's so touchdown dependent, but ultimately he still is an option going into week 17. All right, the second Christmas Day game is going to be the Ravens traveling to face the Texans, and you already know that you're starting Lamar Jackson, your quarterback 1 on the season so far. 21.4 fantasy points this past week, 15 of 23, 207 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, a pick, 22 yards on the ground. So, yeah, there's not a lot to go over here. You got Lamar Jackson. You're feeling great. You have the best quarterback in fantasy football. Start him this week. And I've continuously encouraged you guys, if you have Mark Andrews, keep rolling with him. There's just no way you can bench him. He is a touchdown in every game except for 2 since week 6 of the season. 9 touchdowns in total on the season. The tight end 4 on the season. Double digits in his last 4 games. 13.8 fantasy points this past week. 6 targets, 4 grabs, 37 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Way too good to bench Mark Andrews. Isaiah Likely did have a good game this past week with 11.9 fantasy points. Did score a touchdown, 3 targets, 3 grabs, 29 receiving yards. Have him as a sit. I think he's way too risky in the fantasy championship. But if you're absolutely desperate, this is a player you can always grab more than likely off of the waiver wires, no pun intended, and throw him into your starting lineup. But yeah, unless you're desperate, I just would not risk Likely going into the fantasy championship. And then when we look at the Texans, I'm not starting CJ Stroud. This past week was his best game of the season since week 6 of the season, with 18 fantasy points, 23 of 39, 244 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 picks, and 23 yards on the ground. I haven't had CJ Stroud as a start in weeks, right? I'm just completely avoiding CJ Stroud from a fantasy perspective if you can help it. Double quarterback super flex, Sure, but that's about as far as I'll go. I just don't see any real upside here. Now, it's not a bad matchup. The Ravens have been a little bit better in terms of fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, wide receivers as of late, but they still have not been good on the season. And it is probably a good game script here. A lot of the line for both these teams in terms of playoff implications. But I'm still avoiding CJ Stroud. I won't be surprised if he has like a 17, 18-point day, but I'm staying away, especially with Tank Dell out for the season, right? Dalton Schultz has moved up to the streaming category for me. It was a good matchup last week against the Chiefs. He had a touchdown, 5 receptions, 8 targets, 45 receiving yards, and 15.5 fantasy points. He now has double digits in 2 of his last 3 games. Or really, you can look at it this way. He has double digits in 2 of his last 4 games, single digits in the other 2 of the last 4 games. So, very risky, but it's not an awful matchup this week against the Ravens. And with Tank Dell set to miss the rest of the season, and they're really not being a true wide receiver 2 on this team, Dalton Schultz could see increased volume. But once again, it's risky here in Week 17. All right, let's move into our Thursday night matchup. It's going to be the Seahawks traveling to face the Bears, and let's start with the Seahawks. I'm benching Geno Smith, not starting him. I haven't had Geno as a start in weeks and weeks, but for what it's worth, he had a good game in a tough matchup against the Minnesota Vikings this past week. 23 fantasy points, 31 of 43, 314 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 8 rushing yards. I mean, once again, double quarterback, super flex, sure, but I just think there's other streaming options who are a little bit safer this week in single quarterback formats. Not the worst matchup here against the Bears. As of late, they have not been as impressive, but on the season, they're giving up the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. So I'm just avoiding Geno Smith. I've been avoiding him for weeks. He's going to have these weeks where he pops. Maybe it's this week. I don't know, but I just don't want to risk it in the fantasy championship. Noah Fant is dealing with a knee injury. He didn't make a play or two in that matchup against Minnesota this past week, but there's no way that I'm starting Noah Fant in the fantasy championship. Then when we look at the Bears, Caleb Williams going to be in a void for me as well. Once again, basically the same scenario as Geno Smith, like or double quarterback super flex, sure, but I just don't know if I'm going to roll with Caleb Williams in a single quarterback format this week. Not the worst matchup. Hawks are giving up the 15th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, so kind of right there in the middle. He was solid this past week against a beat-up Detroit Lions team. 26 of 40, 334 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 34 yards on the ground, 2 fumbles, 1 of them lost, 22 fantasy points. I mean, startable, but once again, in the fantasy championship, this is just not what I'm looking for. Now, the Seahawks, the Bears, defensively have been playing a little bit down as of late. Maybe this is one of those matchups that turns into a bit of a shootout. I could see it, but at the same time, I just don't want to risk this in my starting lineup going into the fantasy championship. So I'm avoiding Caleb Williams, and I'm avoiding Cole Kmet. 8.9 fantasy points this past week. Did score a touchdown for what it's worth, but Cole Kmet has given you single digits in every game except for 1 since week 8 of the season. So I'm avoiding Cole Kmet as well this week. So unfortunately, I'm just not very high on this matchup in week 17 for quarterbacks and tight ends. All right, then we're going to get 3 Saturday games. Let's start with the earliest one. That's going to be the Chargers traveling to face the Patriots. And I've got Justin Herbert as a sit. I think he's another one of these quarterbacks that, double quarterback, super flex. He's very startable. Single quarterback, I just don't know. It's been very up and down. We look since week 12, 17 or less fantasy points in 4 out of 5 games. This past week on Thursday Night Football was impressive against Denver on a short week with 23 fantasy points, 23 of 31, 284 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a pick, and 28 yards on the ground. I just don't know how much real upside there is with Herbert on the road here against New England. Not an awful matchup by any stretch. They're giving up the 19th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Once again, it's a fantasy championship. Like, there's a specific type of floor and upside that I'm looking for, and I just don't quite know what we're going to get out of Justin Herbert going into the week. So he is borderline in that type category in a single quarterback league, and still startable in double quarterback super flex formats, but for the most part, I just don't want to roll with Justin Herbert because there's always that chance that we get one of these low ceiling games, and if you do, could really hurt you in the fantasy championship. Now, whatever tight end we're going to get, I mean, Hayden Hurst was activated this past week. Stone Smart was kind of a thing. Will Dissly missed week 16. Whoever it's going to be, I have no interest. There's no way I'm starting any Chargers tight end in the fantasy championship. Now, Drake May of the Patriots did some impressive things this past week. Wasn't that bad. He's had 18 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. I just don't love this matchup against the Chargers, so I have him as a sit. But 22 of 36 this past week, 261 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, an interception, and 30 rushing yards. He's been streamable, don't get me wrong, and he's, once again, one of these quarterbacks, like, if you got nothing better, double quarterback, super flex, yeah, you can go with Drake May. But for majority of you guys in your single quarterback leagues, I'm avoiding Drake May this week. I just don't think there's enough upside. But like I said, he has been solid the past couple weeks. So maybe in terms of a desperation start in single quarterback, he's kind of in a higher tier in that sense. But for the most part, you're probably not going to have to start Drake May in single quarterback leagues this week. Hunter Henry is always in that streaming category. He has double digits in 3 of his last 5 games, scored a touchdown this last week, 13.9 fantasy points, 9 targets, 4 grabs, 39 receiving yards. Not a great matchup this week, but ultimately, Hunter Henry is a tight end that you can always grab, stream if there's nothing better, and cross your fingers that he does have one of those high volume or touchdown games. Moving along in Saturday's action, we're going to have the Broncos traveling to face the Bengals, and let's start with Bo Nix and the Broncos. I'm going to have Bo Nix as a start this week. He'd been kind of trending into a lower tier the 2 previous weeks, but he showed up on Thursday Night Football. 21 fantasy points, 29 of 40, 263 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, no picks, 25 yards on the ground. So now we have 19 or more fantasy points in 3 out of his last 5. Like I said, 2 lower ceiling games in weeks 13 and 15, but he's been solid. He's your quarterback 9 on this season. It's a good matchup against the Bengals. Playoff implications for both these teams, so this is going to be a good game script. If you got Bo Nix, I feel good about him this week. And one of my favorite lines on Underdog going into week 17 is going to be Bo Nix's total passing yards, currently sitting at 239.5 passing yards. He has hit that in 4 out of his last 5 matchups. Like I said, big game for both of these teams. Good game script. Playoff implications for both teams involved. I think Bo Nix will easily hit this line in a good matchup against the Bengals. So I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Bo Nix's total passing yards. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 17's action. Take that free Pick'em. Take the over on Bo Nix's total passing yards. Once both of those lines hit, you'll automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, when you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH on Underdog, that link is down below. Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. No Broncos tight ends that we need to talk about. Lucas Krull, Adam Trotman. There's just nothing here from a fantasy perspective, so we're avoiding all Broncos tight ends like we have been on every given week. And on every given week, we've been starting Joe Burrow. Of course, he's your quarterback 3 on the season. He has less than 19 fantasy points in just 5 games on the season. 21 fantasy points this past week, 23 of 30, 253 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 19 rushing yards. It's the Broncos. They've been a bit wishy-washy lately, but obviously still a good defense. But I have no worries about Joe Burrow this week. I'm absolutely starting him if I got him. Like I said, this is a must-win game for the Bengals. A lot on the line in terms of the playoffs for the Broncos as well. You got Burrow. You got to feel good. You got to start him. Mike Gesicki going to be a sit for me, just 3.4 fantasy points this past week, avoiding him. But we have 2 stud quarterbacks in this game. If you own Nix or Burrow, be confident, roll with them in the fantasy championship. Then the last Saturday game is going to be the Cardinals traveling to face the Rams. So the Cardinals out of playoff contention as of this past week after losing to the Panthers. So I don't know exactly what we're going to get out of this Cardinals team, but I still think Kyler Murray is very startable. But like we said last week, he's just kind of in that category for me. I did encourage a lot of you guys to just roll with him because it was a good matchup against the Panthers. He had 21 fantasy points, 20 of 32, 202 passing yards, a passing touchdown, a pick, 63 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and a lost fumble. So we got all elements of Kyler Murray in one game, but ultimately it was a good fantasy outing. And, it's just tough with Kyler, right? We have 11 or less fantasy points in 2 of his last 5 games, 17 or more in 3 of his last 5 games. And in that same stretch, he has 6 interceptions. So it's just been tough to call with Kyler. But I think he's very startable this week. And I do think that, even though the Cardinals have been eliminated from playoff contention, they're going to go out here and try and make it tough for a divisional opponent in the Rams, right? So I think the game script will be mostly positive. Trey McBride had his worst game of the season this past week in a great matchup against the Panthers and a good game script. Don't know what happened here. 4 targets, 3 grabs, 20 receiving yards, 5 fantasy points, but you own Trey McBride. You just got to forget about the previous week. He's your tight end 5 on the season, and you got to roll with him this week. Don't overthink it. And then we move to the Rams. Matthew Stafford's just going to be a sit for me. I just don't think it's worth the risk. Should have had a floor this past week and only had 7 fantasy points. So now we're looking at 8.2 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games. He was 14 of 19, 110 passing yards, touchdown, a pick, -4 rushing yards. I'm not doing it in the fantasy championship. I mean, he had a really nice stretch between weeks 8 and 14. He had 2 or more passing touchdowns and 18 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2. So, I mean, I just can't risk it. Not in the fantasy championship. You'd have to be really desperate in like a double quarterback type format for me to even consider it. And there's no tight end on the Rams. Davis Allen, Colby Parkinson, Tyler Higbee, whoever it's going to be. I know Higbee had the touchdown this past week, but it is just way too risky to consider a Rams tight end here in the fantasy championship. All right, moving into Sunday's action, let's take a look at the Panthers traveling to face the Buccaneers. So let's start with Bryce Young and company. I think Bryce Young is a streaming option this week. We had him as a streaming option back in week 13 when he faced the Buccaneers, and he had 23 fantasy points in that game. And this past week, very solid against the Arizona Cardinals with 27 fantasy points, 17 of 26, 158 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 68 yards on the ground, a season high for Bryce Young, and a rushing touchdown. So his best game of the season, but that's not why I'm particularly high on Bryce Young. Like I said, it's a good matchup against the Bucs. They've given up a ton of fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season. So if you're in a desperate situation, I do think that Bryce Young is a streaming option here in week 17. In terms of tight ends for the Panthers, there's just nothing we need to talk about. There's nobody who's been a consistent option. So not starting any Panthers tight ends here in week 17. Baker Buddy Mayfield got off to a bit of a slow start in week 16 against the Cowboys, but ultimately finished with 23 fantasy points, 31 of 43, 303 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a pick, and 42 yards on the ground. And this is a great matchup for him against the Panthers. He has 21 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. You own Baker, quarterback 5 on the season. He is a solid start here in week 17. Cade Otton has essentially disappeared, it feels like. He was obviously inactive this past week with the knee injury. If he's able to play here in week 17, I think he is streamable just because it's the Panthers and they've given up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends on the entirety of the fantasy season. But that's it. Like, he's a desperation stream if he's even active. And if he's not, then obviously you're not playing him this week. But it is a desperation stream, and that's it, dependent on his health. And in terms of any other Bucs tight ends, I am not starting any of them here in week 17. Moving along, we're going to have the Jets traveling to face the Bills. Let's start with Aaron Rodgers and company. Rodgers had big performance in week 15. Not a bad matchup against the Rams in week 16. But just 12.8 fantasy points for Rodgers in a low-scoring game. 28 of 42, 256 passing yards, a touchdown, 6 yards on the ground, and a lost fumble. I'm just not doing it. I'm not doing it. Staying completely away from Rodgers this week. No reason to try and start him. Tyler Conklin was not that bad this past week. 7 targets, 5 grabs, 59 receiving yards, and 10 fantasy points. But that was his first double-digit performance since week 8 of the season. I have no interest in starting Tyler Conklin this week. Let's avoid the Jets players for quarterbacks and tight ends. Josh Allen is going into the week as questionable, but I'm not concerned about it. Elbow injury, all that stuff. Bad game in Week 16, one of the biggest busts of Week 16. 16 of 29, 154 passing yards, a passing touchdown, an interception. 30 yards on the ground, but you got to trust your studs. There are playoff seeding and implications here for the Bills. They're going to want to win this game in Week 17, especially if the Chiefs lose to the Steelers on Christmas Day. Ultimately, I think the Jets will come out and try and make this one difficult for a divisional opponent. And there should be enough of a game script here where I am confident in Josh Allen, who's also trying to stay at the top of the MVP race. So I'm not panicking about last week. I'm not panicking about the elbow injury. If I own Josh Allen, I am still starting him in Week 17. Now, in terms of the Bills tight ends, I have no interest in Dalton Kincaid or Dawson Knox. 5.5 fantasy points for Kincaid this past week. 4.2 for Knox. Just not enough here. Staying away from them. So the only player, quarterback or tight end in this matchup that I feel good about is going to be Josh Allen. Next up, we have the Colts, who are traveling to face the Giants, and a pretty dang solid game this past week for Anthony Richardson. 21.2 fantasy points. Didn't do a whole lot passing. 7 of 11. 131 passing yards, a touchdown through the air, an interception, 70 yards on the ground, and a touchdown. And that's the element that A-Rich adds, as he does get it done on the ground. He's had at least 30 rushing yards in each of his starts since Week 11. And in that same stretch, he has a rushing touchdown in every game except for one. And ultimately, he has 20 or more fantasy points in 3 out of those 5 starts and 16 or more fantasy points in 4 out of those 5 starts. And this is a good matchup against the Giants. On top of all of that, this is a big game for the Colts. They are in absolute win-now territory in terms of staying in the playoff race. Richardson sits at 57% rostered. I think he's a good start this week. If you own him, you can roll with him. Double quarterback super flex. You can roll with them. Single quarterback, feel okay here. No tight ends that we need to go over when it comes to the Colts. And when it comes to the Giants, just avoid almost everything except Malik Neighbors and Tyrone Tracy, okay? Drew Lock's set to undergo an MRI, so I don't know what's going to happen here. He's got a shoulder injury. I don't know if we're going to see DeVito or Boyle or whoever. You don't need to start any Giants tight end this week, or quarterback. And yeah, you don't need to start any Giants tight end this week either. There's just nothing of fantasy relevancy here other than the fact that if you play in a league with a defensive special team slot, you can feel pretty dang good about the Colts this week going up against the Giants. But let's avoid all Giants quarterbacks and tight ends in Week 17. All right, next up we have a big divisional matchup between the Packers and the Vikings. Let's start with the Packers side of things, and my kind of tier for Jordan Love over the past couple of weeks has just been in the category. Depends on what you got, depends on what your options are, but like I've said over the past couple of weeks, I think Jordan Love is pretty risky the way that this Packers offense has been operating. And Week 16, that came to life as the Packers just did not need to do a whole lot. Their defense and Josh Jacobs and the run game was doing basically everything. He was 16 of 28, 182 passing yards, did have the early passing touchdown to Dontavion Wicks and 2 rushing yards, but he literally did not need to do anything else. But I will say, this is a tougher matchup this week against the Vikings for the entirety of the Packers team, but I think this is actually a pretty good matchup for Jordan Love as the Vikings give up a fair amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks and a lot of fantasy points to wide receivers. So this will be a better overall game script. And like I said, this is a big divisional matchup, playoff implications on the line for both of these teams. So I feel a little bit better about Jordan Love this coming week. I think he could be closer to like the 17 or 18 points that he had in weeks 15 and 13, but hard to really tell what Jordan Love's ceiling is, although the Vikings are pretty dang good against opposing running backs, so this should be a game where he is forced to throw the football more due to the game script and due to the run defense of the Vikings. Tucker Kraft, in that same category, made a couple big plays against the Saints this past week. 4 targets, 3 catches, 63 receiving yards, and 9.5 fantasy points. But, I mean, he has one game this year where he did not score a touchdown, and still had double digits. Every other game where he has scored double digits on the season, he has scored a touchdown. He's a bit touchdown dependent, to say the least, but he is a tight end 6 on the season. So if you roll with him, you just got to understand the risk, but he's definitely very startable. When it comes to the Vikings, I'm going to continue to start Sam Darnold no matter what, as I have been talking about for weeks and weeks now here on the channel. Your quarterback 8 on the season. I know it was a down week in week 15, then we had the rain and all that stuff. It did not matter in week 16. Darnold was 22 of 35, 246 passing yards, 3 tutties, 11 rushing yards, 22 fantasy points, 19 or more fantasy points in every game except for 1 since week 11, and every game except for 2 since week 8. So you got Darnold, feel good, big game here, roll with them. TJ Hawkinson is kind of in that streaming category, and I've been talking about this for weeks and weeks, and I keep getting hate about Hawkinson, but he's still, this past week was the first game he was on the field for more than 68% of snaps, and they're still giving snaps to Johnny Munt and Josh Oliver as well, right? It's just the way that they run this offense, and Hawkinson is the most viable option from a fantasy perspective. I mean, the other two didn't even have any targets this past week, right? But you just don't know what you're going to get out of Hawkinson on a weekly basis. But this is a good game script, should benefit Hawkinson in the passing game. But understand that there's plenty of risk if you're going to roll with TJ Hawkinson going into week 17. All right, next up we have the matchup everyone's been waiting for. That's the Raiders traveling to face the Saints. And let's take a look at Aiden O'Connell, who had a great matchup this past week and looked like he could have been a streaming option. And it was just good old Aiden O'Connell, nothing more, right? 24-38, 257 passing yards, 12 yards on the ground. No turnovers, but 11.4 fantasy points. Not going to cut it. Not going to be a streaming option this week, even against the Saints, who are completely battered right now all over the place, mainly offensively. But yeah, I'm staying away from O'Connell. No reason to try and get cute here. Brock Bowers, however, had 20 fantasy points in week 16 against the Jags, 11 receptions off of 13 targets, 99 receiving yards. Doesn't matter the matchup. Doesn't really matter the quarterback situation for me, although the ceiling was much lower with Desmond Ridder as a starter. I am just going to start Brock Bowers if I got him, no matter what. In terms of the Saints offense, and we talked about it all last week, we talked about streaming the Packers defense. We talked about all of this, right? And listen, I got Jake Hader's name on the screen because you just never know. Maybe he makes an appearance. Maybe it's just Spencer Rattler this week. Whoever it is, just stay away. Spencer Rattler, 5 fantasy points this past week, 15 of 30, 153 passing yards, an interception, a fumble, 28 yards on the ground. In terms of the tight ends, Jawan Johnson had 4.7 fantasy points this past week. Foster Moreau had 5.3. And, I mean, MVS missed this past week. Alvin Kamara's hurt. Taysom Hill's out for the season. Remember Chris Olave, he hasn't been around in weeks and weeks and weeks. There's just nobody on this team to throw to. It's a complete mess. Kendre Miller did not come through for you guys. There's literally no offense. This has to be the worst offense in the NFL right now. There's just nobody here. Do not start either of these quarterbacks in any format going into week 7. Speaking of teams with great quarterbacks, let's take a look at the Titans traveling to face the Jaguars, and let's start with the Titans side of things. So there are apparent reports that Mason Rudolph might get benched this week. I don't even know what's going on with this quarterback situation. I know Will Levis does have a shoulder injury, so maybe they're trying to rest that, and now they want to see more of Will Levis for some reason. I don't know, but I actually think if Rudolph plays and is the starter in week 17, if you were 110% desperate in like a superflex type format, you could probably stream him against the Jags. He has 16 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. Like, I think he could get 16 or 17 fantasy points against the Jags. But yeah, he had 3 interceptions this past week. He did throw for 252 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns. And I don't want to start Rudolph, but if he's the starter, the matchup's there, and he could probably get you a floor, but no real ceiling, right? And for the most part, I am not recommending starting Rudolph or Levis. I think you guys stay away from this matchup by all means possible when it comes to the quarterback position. Josh Weil, going to be a sit for me, but I think Chicken Conquo is a solid streaming option. Great matchup against the Jags this week, especially if Mason Rudolph is the starting quarterback. He likes to target Chicken Conquo, who has 10 or more targets in his last 2 games, 8 or more catches in his last 2 games, and 13 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games. This past week, 19.1 fantasy points and 81 receiving yards off of 9 catches. And this is the Jags, one of the very worst teams in the NFL in terms of fantasy points allowed to tight ends. So Chicken Conquo is in the streaming category this week, especially if Mason Rudolph is the starting quarterback. I might get a little bit more worried if we see Will Levis at quarterback, though. Mac Jones, 13 fantasy points this past week, 25 of 39, 247 passing yards, a passing touchdown. Yeah, just no thank you. I know we've seen some okay games out of Mac Jones, but come on. What type of situation are you in that you need to roll with Mac Jones this week? Just please don't start him. Brenton Strange, a little banged up this past week. I'm very upset about Brenton Strange. Was supposed to be a good streaming option, good matchup. Wasn't there. 4 targets, 2 grabs, 22 receiving yards, 2 fantasy points, a costly fumble. Just stay away from Brenton Strange. The Strange Man dream is over. He's not going to be a streaming option with no Evan Ingram. So Chicken Conquo, about the only player that I really have any confidence in this matchup for quarterbacks and tight ends in Week 17. Let's move along to the Dolphins traveling to face the Browns. And let's start with Tua Tagovailoa. Just kind of in that type category for me. If you don't have anything better, you could roll with him. This is a must-win game for the Dolphins, so the game script should be there. Not the greatest, not the worst matchup against the Browns, but Tua was not so great this past week against the Niners. 12.5 fantasy points, 22 of 34, 215 passing yards, and a passing touchdown. Definitely not what you want to look for. Jalen Waddle's banged up. Tyreek Hill was dropping footballs this past week. It's just tough to call what you're going to get with Tua. I would avoid him if possible. Johnny Smith remains a start for me no matter what. 6 targets, 6 grabs, 62 receiving yards, 12.2 fantasy points this past week. You got Johnny Smith. He's your tight end 3 on the season. Keep rolling with Jonnu with confidence. Now we got the Browns. What do we do here? Dorian Thompson-Robinson dealing with a calf injury. Jameis Winston was the quarterback 3 this past week as he had been nursing a shoulder injury. Bailey Zappi was the quarterback 2 this past week. I was going to tell you guys, I don't care who it is. I don't even care if it's Jameis Winston. I'm just staying away from the Browns quarterbacks this week. I have no interest whatsoever starting any of them. Miami's pass defense is very good. I just am staying away here. I have no interest whatsoever. Like I said, even if Jameis Winston is active and is a starter, I don't care. I'm just staying away. Too much risk. David Njoku, I'm just going to say, is probably not playing this week. But if he somehow finds a way to play, I think you can start David Njoku. I mean, he had 14.6 fantasy points this past week, 10 targets, 8 grabs, 66 receiving yards with DTR at quarterback. So I think he'll be okay. Has a floor at worst. But once again, he's dealing with that knee injury, going to have an MRI, was already dealing with an injury going into the week. I'm just going to say I don't think he's going to play. So if Njoku's your starting tight end, you probably need to look elsewhere. But if he does play, he's still startable here in Week 17. Moving along, we're going to have the Cowboys traveling to face the Eagles. Let's see if the Cowboys can pull up another upset and hurt the Eagles' playoff seedings. I'm sure they're going to try. Let's look at the quarterbacks and tight ends for the Cowboys. I got Cooper Rush as a sit. He's been a streaming option, I think, in quite a few of the past couple of matchups, and I even had him as a streaming option this past week, and didn't quite come through, but he had 15 fantasy points, 26 of 35, 292 passing yards, a passing touchdown. But ultimately, I'm not going to start him against his Eagles defense. No way. Not even going to consider him a streaming option. And I don't feel very good about these tight ends. I know Jake Ferguson had a decent game this past week, and, you know, I just don't know that I want to risk it here in the fantasy championship. I don't think it's worth it. And Luke Schoonmaker only had 1 catch this past week. And Ferguson, I mean, had 10 points, but had single digits in each of his previous 2 games since returning from injury. So I don't think we need to risk it with any of these Cowboys offensive players at quarterback or tight end. Really, the only Cowboys players I'm considering this week would be CeeDee Lamb and maybe Rico Dowdle, and I don't feel very good about Dowdle. Anyways, looking at the Eagles situation, what's going to happen here as Jalen Hurts had to exit Week 16's game early against the Commanders with a concussion and has been in concussion protocol. What do you do with Jalen Hurts? Is he going to play this week? Well, it's still very much up in the air. I think there's a good shot he does play. I hate to say it, but I think that if we've seen any concussion protocol this year that's going to be glanced over quite a bit with the, playoff implications on the line here for the Eagles, the Commanders starting to catch up in that division. This is a divisional matchup, Christmas weekend. Yeah, I won't be surprised if Jalen Hurts is out there, but I also won't be surprised if we get a last-minute, kind of call that he does not play. So very much up in the air here, but if you own Jalen Hurts, I'm still starting Jalen Hurts. If he's active, I'm going to play him. And that's basically it. If Kenny Pickett gets to start, I'm not playing him. But Kenny Pickett's dealing with a rib injury. Dare I say Tanner McKee might be out there? I don't know. But if it's not Jalen Hurts, whoever it's going to be, I'm staying away at the quarterback position. Grant Calcaterra, going to be your tight end here in Week 17. Going to be a sit for me. 0 fantasy points in Week 16 for Calcaterra. So not looking too incredibly positive for this matchup between the Cowboys and the Eagles for these positions. But if Hurts is active, I will still roll with him in Week 17. Let's move into Sunday Night Football and start with the Falcons traveling to face the Commanders. Let's look at Michael Penix, who, listen, I understand it. It's exciting. It's a rookie quarterback. Jaden Daniels, who we're about to talk about, has had some fantastic starts as a rookie quarterback, including his very first start. But I still can't believe I had to argue with people to sit Michael Penix in the semifinals in Week 16. And listen, it was his first start. The defense did a lot. Bijan Robinson did a ton. And this game script will be a little bit tougher, meaning that he'll probably need to throw the football more this week. And he was not awful throwing the football against the Giants. 18-27, 202 passing yards. Did throw a pick and just 3 rushing touchdowns, 7.3 fantasy points, but there's just no way in the fantasy championship that I am risking Michael Penix in his second ever NFL start against the Commanders. I know the Commanders aren't a fantastic defense, but they're not a bad defense, and they have played much better the second half of the season, So please don't get cute. I am not going to ever recommend for the entirety of the week to start Michael Penix. I just can't believe that people fell for that in Week 16. There's no way that you can start Penix in the fantasy championship. It is way too risky. And please, for the love of fantasy football and Christmas Day, just drop Kyle Pitts from your roster. Why is Kyle Pitts 77% rostered? I have for weeks told you guys, just move on. It's over. Drop Kyle Pitts. You're going to get coal in your stocking this year. Okay, the Commanders. I've highly encouraged you guys to start Jaden Daniels, and I don't know why I've had to continue to argue for Jaden Daniels, but what a day in Week 16, 36 fantasy points, 24-39, 258 passing yards, 5 touchdowns through the air, 2 interceptions, 81 rushing yards. Just start Jaden Daniels, your quarterback 4 on the season. I think you guys should have confidence by now. He's 23 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games. Keep rolling with them. Zach Ertz probably should have not played this past week, but he did against his former team and had 2.2 fantasy points, 2 targets, 1 catch, 12 receiving yards. He's still streamable. Week 15 he got hurt. Week 16 he shouldn't have played, but he did play. Outside of that, he had 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games. So he's streamable, but it just depends on what other options you have at tight end here in Week 17. And last but not least, on Monday Night Football, we're going to have a rematch of last year's NFC Championship game with the Lions traveling to face the Niners. Let's start with the Lions. And, I really talked a lot about Jared Goff this past week and all the reasons why he should have a solid game. And I still got a little bit worried with him in the cold against the Bears. And he had a very solid game, right? 25 fantasy points, 23 of 32, 336 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. I just don't think there's any way that we can bench Jared Goff moving forward. This is not a great matchup. This Niners defense was pretty dang good against Tua this past week. but I just have a tough time. I mean, Goff has 2 or more passing touchdowns in every game since week 10, except for 1, in every game since week 3, except for 2. And what I talked a lot about last week is that I really thought that David Montgomery being out was going to have a huge impact on this team in terms of passing the football, because yes, everyone initially was saying Jahmyr Gibbs going to have a huge game, and yes, Jahmyr Gibbs did have a big game, and I expected that as well, but that 1-2 punch of Monty and Gibbs was so crucial to the way that this offense was doing things that now they're going to have to open things up with guys like Laporta and Jameson Williams, and of course Amon-Ra St. Brown, and I was saying that all of last week, and that's exactly what happens. Even if the fake stumble play is only going to happen against a team as bad as the Bears, and J-Mo had the huge touchdown, which is hard to call when that's going to happen. It's still exactly what happened this past week, right? And this is a big game for the Lions. They're beat up defensively. The game script should be positive. There's playoff implications for the Lions, especially with Week 18. They're facing the Vikings, so this should be a good game script. Everything's there. I'm just going to have confidence in Goff this week. I think he's going to be solid. And if you own him, he is a good start. And I'm going to keep rolling with Sam Laporta. Have had him as a start over the past couple of weeks. 10 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games. 10 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2 since week 10 of the season. 14.3 this past week. If you own him, feel good. You can roll with him. And Brock Wright has had 0 catches in his past 3 games, so not an option there. Let's talk about the Niners, though. I think that Brock Purdy is a solid start this week. 22.1 fantasy points this past week, 26 of 40, 313 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a pick, and 26 yards on the ground. But once again, this Lions defense is just so banged up. I think Purdy can come through with a similar stat line, and I don't think that the Niners are just going to keel over, give the Lions a free win at home here. I know they've been eliminated from playoff contention, but they came out and they competed against the Dolphins this past week, and Purdy, of all players, on the line for a big contract extension this offseason. I think he's going to come out and try and do whatever he can against this Lions defense. So I think Purdy is a solid start. Maybe not the most upside, but a good start here in Week 17. And if I got George Kittle, even though it's a tough matchup this week, I'm going to keep rolling with George Kittle. 18.6 fantasy points this past week, 9 targets, 8 grabs, 106 receiving yards. This is your tight end 1 so far on the season. I'm still rolling with George Kittle if I got him. I'm not overthinking it, so I think there's a lot of good starts at quarterback and tight end in this final game of the championship week. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single matchup, every single quarterback, every single tight end, and who you should be starting or sitting as we move into the final week of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 17, please drop me a comment. I will get back to as many of you guys as I possibly can. But most importantly, please make sure that you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because we're going to have plenty of content for the remainder of the week to help you guys bring home a championship here in the 2024 fantasy football season. So make sure that you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the videos. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and Merry Christmas, as well as remember, you saw it here on The Catch.